Paris in December is usually defined by a biting chill, the kind of wintry gray that seeps into your bones and makes you pull your coat tighter as you hurry past the glowing storefronts. But tonight, underneath the towering iron lattice of the world's most recognizable monument, the air didn't feel cold at all. It felt overwhelmingly electric, charged with an energy that the confused French locals and shivering tourists couldn't quite identify. If you were standing on the Champs de Mars just an hour ago, looking up at the sparkling lights of the Eiffel Tower, you wouldn't have just seen scattered groups snapping selfies. You would have witnessed a slow, steady accumulation of people, a gathering storm of smiles, familiar accents, and excited whispers that suddenly erupted into a joyous, deafening roar that absolutely drowned out the Parisian traffic. What unfolded here wasn't a planned concert with tickets and security gates, nor was it some government-sanctioned diplomatic event. It was something far more raw and powerful, a spontaneous, heartfelt reclamation of space by a community thousands of miles from home, proving that the Filipino spirit is simply too vibrant to ever be contained by geography. And tonight, right here in the heart of France, we are going to show you exactly how they turn the city of lights into a massive Barangay Fiesta. To truly understand the magnitude of what happened beneath the Eiffel Tower tonight, you first have to understand what Christmas means to a Filipino, because it is not just a holiday in the Philippines. It is a season, a state of mind, and arguably the longest-running festival on the planet. While the rest of the world is still clinging to the last days of summer, the Philippines enters the BER months on September 1st, and like clockwork, Jose Marichan begins dominating the airwaves in every mall from Manila to Davao, signaling a 4-month marathon of festivities that is deeply ingrained in the national psyche. It is a time characterized by an explosion of color, specifically the kaleidoscope patterns of the parole, lanterns hanging outside every window, symbolizing the Star of Bethlehem, and the guiding light of hope that refuses to be extinguished regardless of economic hardships or natural disasters. This relentless positivity, this insistence on celebration, is the armor Filipinos wear, and when you take a Filipino out of that environment and drop them into the gray, quiet, often solitary winter of Northern Europe, that armor begins to feel incredibly heavy, and the silence of a foreign Christmas becomes deafening. For the thousands of Filipinos living in Paris, the Overseas Filipino Workers, OFWs, sending money back home, the students navigating a complex new language, the diplomats, and the long-term residents, December can actually be the most difficult month of the year, a time when the pang of homesickness evolves into a physical ache. In the Philippines, Christmas Eve, or Noche Buena, is a sensory overload of open doors, neighbors spilling into the streets, the smell of roasting lechon mixing with sweet bibingka, and karaoke machines running hot until sunrise. It is communal, loud, and incredibly warm in every sense of the word. Contrast that with Paris, where Christmas is beautiful but often intensely private, celebrated behind closed doors with immediate family, leaving those without relatives nearby feeling profoundly isolated in a city of millions. They see the stunning lights along the Avenue Montaigne and they appreciate the beauty, but it doesn't feel like their Christmas because it lacks the crucial ingredient of bayanihan, that uniquely Filipino spirit of communal unity and shared burden, which is never more necessary than during the holidays. This underlying current of shared longing is what laid the groundwork for tonight's extraordinary event, a demonstration that began not with a grand organizational plan, but with quiet conversations in Filipino grocery stores in the 16th arrondissement and excited messages passed around in WhatsApp groups used by domestic helpers and nannies across the city. Someone mentioned how much they missed the specific sound of Christmas caroling in the Philippines, the way groups of children would bang on homemade drums and sing slightly off-key versions of traditional songs until they were rewarded with coins. The idea started as a whisper. What if we just met up, a few dozen of us, somewhere public, just to sing one song together to feel a little less alone? But in true Filipino fashion, the idea of a few dozen is an impossibility when the prospect of connection is on the table, and the whisper grew into a shout that traveled across the digital diaspora network in France. The location had to be iconic, somewhere undeniable, And the Eiffel Tower was chosen not just because it is the symbol of Paris, but because standing beneath it is the ultimate proof of how far they have traveled from the rice fields of Luzon or the beaches of Visayas. The logistical challenges of organizing what was essentially a flash mob in one of the most heavily secured tourist sites in the world, especially in a city perpetually on high alert, were immense, requiring a level of coordination that happened almost entirely beneath the radar of the authorities. There were no permits applied for, no stages built, no sound systems rented. The plan relied entirely on the discipline of the crowd and the sheer vocal power of hundreds of people singing in unison. The word went out to dress warmly, but to wear something distinctly Filipino underneath the heavy winter coats, a barong Tagalog tucked into jeans, a scarf with the colors of the flag, or just a bright, festive red sweater that defied the Parisian preference for somber black and gray clothing. They were told to arrive in small, inconspicuous groups, to mingle like tourists on the Trocadero viewing platform or the Champ de Mars lawns, and to wait for a specific signal that would happen right as the hour struck and the tower began its famous 5-minute sparkling light show. As the afternoon faded into twilight and the temperature dropped near freezing, the atmosphere around the base of the tower began to shift subtly, a change that would have been imperceptible to anyone not tuned into the specific frequency of Filipino social dynamics. If you looked closely, you began to notice that the tourists taking pictures were lingering a little longer than usual, that their eyes were scanning the crowd, making quick, knowing eye contact with strangers who looked like kin. You could hear snippets of Tagalog, Ilocano, Cebuano, and Bicolano cutting through the ambient noise of French, English, and Mandarin, a linguistic tapestry weaving itself together in the shadow of the Iron Giant. There was a nervous energy, a collective holding of breath, because everyone knew that what they were about to do was slightly rebellious, a benign disruption of the orderly French public space, but the need to express their collective identity outweighed the fear of a scolding from a gendarme. By the time darkness had fully settled and the golden lights of the Eiffel Tower illuminated the frost forming on the grass, the crowd had swelled far beyond anyone's initial expectations, with estimates ranging from 500 to perhaps 1,000 Filipinos gathered in a loose formation. It wasn't just OFWs. Entire multi-generational families who had settled in France years ago showed up, bringing elderly Lolas in wheelchairs wrapped in blankets, alongside teenagers who spoke perfect French but whose hearts still beat to a Filipino rhythm. They came carrying backpacks that seemed suspiciously heavy, stuffed not with camera gear but with plastic containers of adobo, pancit, and suman, ready to be clandestinely shared once the singing was done, because no Filipino gathering is ever complete without the sharing of food, regardless of the venue or the legality. The sheer size of the gathering began to attract attention. Regular tourists stopped their sightseeing, sensing that something significant was imminent, turning their phone cameras away from the tower and toward this growing sea of expectant brown faces. Then, the moment arrived, the clock struck the hour, and the Eiffel Tower erupted into its dazzling, shimmering dance of 20,000 flashing bulbs, a spectacle that usually commands absolute silence and awe. But tonight, the sparkling lights served merely as the backdrop, the visual accompaniment to an auditory explosion that began with a single, piercing whistle from somewhere near the center of the crowd, followed by the strumming of a lone, brave acoustic guitar that had been hidden under a poncho. It wasn't a perfect studio intro, but it was enough. It was the spark that ignited the gasoline, and instantly, hundreds of voices joined together on the very first beat, crashing into the night air with supreme confidence. They didn't need song sheets or lyrics projected on a screen. The song they chose is burned into the DNA of every Filipino from the moment they can speak, a melody that instantly transports them back to humid December nights and the embrace of family. They began to sing Ang Pasko Ay Sumapit, the definitive, quintessential Filipino Christmas anthem, a song that is simultaneously joyous, nostalgic, and deeply resonant with historical meaning. The opening lyrics, Ang Pasko Ay Sumapit, Tayo ay mangagsia wit, Christmas has arrived, let us all sing, are a command, an imperative to shake off sadness and embrace the season with full-throated enthusiasm. As the familiar, upbeat, marching band tempo of the song echoed off the cold stone and ironwork of Paris, a visible transformation overtook the crowd. Shoulders hunched against the cold suddenly straightened, tired eyes lit up with an inner fire, and the reserved demeanor required for survival in a foreign land evaporated instantly. They weren't just singing notes, they were shouting their existence to the European sky, declaring that even here, in this strange and distant land, the spirit of the Filipino Pasko was alive and kicking. The volume was staggering. It was a wall of sound, a raw, unfiltered outpouring of emotion that seemed to physically push back the surrounding winter chill. It was the sound of mothers missing their children back in Manila, of fathers working double shifts in French kitchens to afford tuition fees in Cebu, of students lonely in their dorm rooms, all channeling their collective longing into one unified voice. You could see tears streaming down faces, not tears of sadness, but tears of overwhelming relief and pride, a cathartic release of months of pent-up homesickness. People who were complete strangers 5 minutes ago were suddenly linking arms, swaying side to side in the traditional rhythmic movement that accompanies the song, forming a human chain that transcended social classes and regional backgrounds. In that moment, there were no Tagalogs or Bisayas, only Filipinos. The reaction of the non-Filipinos in the vicinity was a fascinating study in human behavior, shifting rapidly from mild annoyance at the disruption to confusion, and finally settling into sheer delight and admiration. French security guards who had initially started walking toward the center of the crowd with stern expressions stopped in their tracks, disarmed by the undeniable joy of the scene, realizing that this was not a protest or a riot, but a celebration of pure happiness. Tourists from America, Japan, and Germany lower their phones, mesmerized not by the tower, but by the passion of the singers, some even trying to clap along to the infectious, uniquely Filipino rhythm, caught up in the universal language of joy. For those few minutes, the Filipinos were not the service workers in the background or the quiet immigrants on the metro. They were the main event, the masters of ceremony, teaching the heart of Paris a lesson in how to truly celebrate life. As they reach the bridge of a song, the part that slows down and speaks about the three kings, the singing became more reverent, more soulful, before building up again to the raucous, celebratory climax. The contrast between the formal, rigid architecture of Haussmann's Paris and this organic, chaotic, beautiful explosion of island energy was stark and profoundly moving. It was a visual and auditory representation of the diaspora experience, taking up space in a world that wasn't built for you, and filling it with your own vibrant culture until it feels a little bit more like home. They were reclaiming the night, proving that while they might be serving French food by day or cleaning French offices, their souls remained stubbornly, proudly Filipino, nurtured by traditions that are fireproof and waterproof, capable of surviving any migration. When the final, triumphant note of Pasko Ay Sumapit rang out, held for an impressively long time by hundreds of lungs, it didn't fade into silence. It was immediately replaced by pandemonium of cheering, hugging, and cries of Malagang Pasko. Merry Christmas! The energy didn't dissipate. It transformed into the next inevitable phase of any Filipino gathering, the socializing and the picture-taking. The human chain broke apart into hundreds of smaller reunions, phone cameras flashing wildly as everyone tried to capture proof that they were part of this historic night. It was a chaotic swirl of laughter and tearful embraces, a massive family reunion of people related not by blood, but by shared culture and shared sacrifice. Almost immediately, the clandestine food stash appeared. Zipped jackets were opened to reveal plastic bags filled with pandesal, aluminum foil-wrapped portions of Filipino spaghetti, and even small containers of dinuguan, which were passed around with stealth and speed. The Champ de Mars was briefly transformed into a giant, chilly picnic ground, with Filipinos urging stunned bystanders to cane pateo, let's eat, offering food to anyone within arm's reach, because hospitality is a reflex that cannot be turned off. This sharing of sustenance was just as important as the singing. It was the physical manifestation of their care for one another, a way of saying, I know it's hard here, but we have each other, and we have our food. As the adrenaline rush began to subside and the reality of the freezing temperature started to creep back in, the crowd slowly began to disperse, melting back into the Paris metro system, heading back to cramped apartments in the suburbs or preparing for night shifts. But the atmosphere had shifted irrevocably. They were walking taller, smiling broader, carrying the warmth of that shared 30 minutes like a shield against the bitter winter night. They were leaving behind a confused but delighted Parisian public who would go home and tell their families about the time a joyous army of Filipinos hijacked the Eiffel Tower with nothing but their voices and their incredible spirit. This event was more than just a viral video opportunity or a flash mob. It was a necessary act of cultural survival, a psychological pressure valve release for a community that gives so much of itself to the world and often asks for very little in return. It was a reminder to themselves that even though they are scattered across the globe, powering economies far from their own, they are never truly disconnected as long as they remember the songs, the traditions, and the indomitable joy that defines them. The Eiffel Tower may belong to France, standing tall as a marvel of engineering, but for one glorious, freezing night in December, the air surrounding it belonged entirely to the Philippines, vibrating with the undeniable sound of a people who know how to make a home wherever they happen to stand.